Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Trumpeter's newly released UH-1B Huey in 1/35th scale. Hope you enjoy. So then, I'm going to start off this build by building up the interior. On screen, you can see me putting all the control columns into position. Now, I personally haven't built a new Trumpeter kit in a very long time, so I was pleasantly surprised to see the incredible level of detail on a few of these parts. Look how great that textured grip looks on this control column. Another beautifully detailed part is going to be the instrument panel. This can get cemented into the underside of the anti-glare shield. Now I can start to have a look at building up the pilot seats. These have a really beautiful and quite intricate level of framework, as you can see on screen, which goes with them. I recommend using either some fast setting cement or even super glue to ensure rigidity when you put it together. My one criticism that I would have of this part of the build is a lack of positive fitment. I really did find myself putting a lot of these parts on in almost a butt joint fashion, slapping them on and getting some glue on there, so potentially it wasn't the best design in this area. Once these two seats were all done and dusted, I could move on to looking at the main cabin seats. There are two seats which just sit in the middle of the cabin, and then there's a bank of seats which goes off of the rear wall. Talking of the rear wall, there is some lovely moulding here. You can see almost these ripples in the fabric, and also that lovely hex mesh looking pattern which is so iconic on so many helicopters. As I mentioned earlier, another bank of seats is cemented to this part along with its framework. I then moved on to building up the fully moulded engine that Trumpeter provides. It's a very impressive little sub-assembly, it's got lots of details and it's relatively easy to put together. The one thing I would say is Trumpeter don't actually tell you how to display the engine, however there are two engine access doors which I think could be positioned in the open position. I personally didn't. One small issue that I did encounter were these two assemblies not going together very well. So what I ended up doing was just separating the box assembly looking thing into two halves and then rejoining it with it in the middle. With those final two connecting rods into position, I could finally start to get some paint onto this model. All of the sub-assemblies initially received a generous coating of Mr. Finishing Surfaces 1500 Black before I could go on to do the first bit of painting on the interior. So the first colour which we're going to be doing is going to be using Mr. Colour's C363, which is medium sea grey. I'm going to be using this colour in a black basing fashion, which pretty much means all I'm going to be doing is spraying in between all of the panels and then slowly blending across to give us some very natural shading. Once I was happy with how the medium sea grey was looking, I could move on to having a look at a couple of the engine components. These are just going to be lightly dusted with Mr. Metal Colours Superfine Silver 2. I found that dusting this colour really helps to give the most authentic results. Once everything had dried, I could move on to doing some detail painting. Initially, I've used Ammo Mig's Matte Black to block in the control panel and also a couple of aspects on the instrument panel, and then I'm going to use a nice finely tipped brush dipped in some white to try and paint on a few of the dials. Now, I've also been experimenting with the AmmoMig lock and load pens recently, and I think I found a pretty helpful little use for them. All of these raised details would have taken me probably 10-15 minutes to block in by hand, but here I am just using the white lead, and in a matter of seconds they are all blocked in and they're all really nicely detailed. So potentially this is another way to use the AmmoMig lock and load. I got my lock and load from Hannons London. Hannons London is my local model shop and long-term sponsor of the channel. It has everything from all the latest kits, full Mr. Hobby and ammo paint range, along with so much more. We are constantly adding new products into stock, so it is the place to be if you are looking for new and helpful tools like the lock and load. As well, I am personally there on Sundays working on my latest project or having great conversations with you guys. So if you're in the area, pop in and get yourself a new project. I'm now getting all of the sub-assemblies into their positions, including the instrument panel, this front frame section, and both the pilot and co-pilot seats. Before all of these sub-assemblies were put into position, they all were given a generous coating of VMS's matte varnish. And the reason behind this is because when I go on to this next step of doing a bit of dry brushing to help accentuate any details, it usually grips and works a little bit better on a satin or matte varnish rather than a glossy surface. Once the ceiling of the cabin is secured, I can move on to building up the engine. This is a relatively stress-free process, with all of the sub-assemblies having nice big locating tabs, making sure they have secure and proper fitment. One place which did require a little bit more elbow grease was getting the exhaust pipe through this framework at the back. I really did have to put a bit of force to get it to eventually pop through. With the exhaust all secured, that finishes up the engine sub-assembly, and I must say it is very cool looking. I'm slightly regretting not having it on show on the finished model. This now slots into position with two really beefy tabs, which once again require quite a bit of force to get them into position, but once they're there, they're not going anywhere. Now, that entire sub-assembly can be cemented into one side of the fuselage halves before they can be sandwiched together. After the two halves had been put together, it revealed a slightly undesirable seam the entire way along the front end of the aircraft. This was sorted out just using some filler, but it is something to bear in mind. Moving on with the build, I can now put in those engine access doors, and they actually have a really nice fitment. Now one or two parts have to be secured around the base of the rotor. After putting some primer onto the model, it revealed that a few of my seams were still very much there. So after 3 or 4 passes with some more filler and primer, I was at a stage where I was relatively happy. I can now move on to use some photo etch, which is included in the kit. This is for the exhaust kind of ports on either side of the engine. I could then flip the airframe over and attach the landing skids to the bottom. Once this was finished, I could put on some latex gloves to minimise any fingerprints which might have occurred when handling the glass. All of this glass and doors went into place relatively well. There were a few gaps which had to be cleaned up using some Vallejo acrylic putty, which can be wiped away using water. Once everything was secured, I could use the included mask set to mask off the majority of the glass, with the exception of one or two. Then the entire airframe could receive a generous coating of Mr. Finishing Surfaces 1500 Black in preparation for painting. So the first colour which I'm going to be using is Mr. Colour's C304, which is a very light shade of olive drab. Whilst looking at some references, I found that this colour was probably the most accurate that I could use for my model, but also that the Hueys weren't necessarily incredibly weathered, but they had a worn look about them. Not incredibly battered and falling apart, but definitely accentuated panels and some grit and grime around them. To make sure I didn't lose any of the panels and lovely detail which is present on this model, I black based just like I did on the interior. I turned the air pressure down on my airbrush and very carefully marbled and traced in between all of the panels. After I'd gone around the entirety of the airframe doing this, I could then start to blend everything together. To do this, I brought the airbrush back a little bit from the model and very gently went in uniform passes to slowly build in the colour. Here was the result after that first effect, and it looks good, but not exactly what I was looking for. The next stage which I'm going to do is hopefully bring out a few more of the details through highlighting, and it also adds into this faded sort of effect. I've taken the original Mr. Colour C304 and added a few drops of Sky Type S into the mix. This gives me a lighter and slightly more saturated version of the paint, which I can then go on to highlight certain features. I had great success using this highlighted paint towards the back of the aircraft, where I did certain shapes almost like an L, and it helped me to create this stressed skin effect, which I think was really convincing. Now with the highlights all done, the airframe was looking very bright indeed. To tone everything down, I was going to use some shading. With a very highly diluted pure black in the brush and quite a low air pressure, I went along some of the major panel or rivet lines and very slowly started to build up this darkened tone. What this did was help to balance out the overall tone and colour of the aircraft. I tried to focus the majority of the shading around high usage areas, whether that be engine hatches, main doors, or any of those other areas. Once all the shading was finished, here was the final result. I must say I was really quite happy with how this came out, with the exception of one or two areas. A few areas where the shading might have been a little bit too intense, I loaded Mr. Colour C304, the olive drab, back into the airbrush and slowly toned it down where it was to my liking. And there we go, that was the final result, and I was really happy with how this pretty monotone olive drab managed to pop out. I think it has a nice level of shading and also visual interest. Something which I think is going to add even more visual interest to this model is a huge shark mouth on the front. I know, I don't think it is historically accurate, and I don't think any of the UH-1Bs actually did have shark mouths, but it just would look so cool, and it's so iconic to see a Huey with a shark mouth. So I masked it off, primed everything with Mr. Colour's white, then cut out a hell of a lot of little triangles and stuck them on, and then I could use Mr. Colour's super Italian red and very gently dusted it all over until I was happy with the tone that I had achieved. Once it had all been left to dry, I had the very satisfying task of peeling off all the little teeth, and luckily there wasn't really any overspray. So that concludes the painting for this model, and I was really happy with how it came out. Now everything received a generous coating of GX100 gloss varnish, and the decals could then be applied. With my late addition of a shark mouth on the front of this thing, I kind of eliminated any way that I could use the decals in the kit with them being historically accurate. So it was at this point where I've renamed this build a bit more of a what if scheme. Let me know down in the comments if you think this was the right idea, or should I have done one of the schemes which come in the box. The Trumpeter decals were pretty hard to get down onto the model. They required quite a few coats of Mr. Mark Softer to get them to fully conform into all those lovely rivets, but we got there in the end. I can now move on to building up the rest of the main rotor head assembly. It's good to note that on a lot of these cylindrical parts, Trumpeter have left some quite prominent mould lines which have to be cleaned up either with a scalpel or just sanding them off. But if you can look past that, you'll see that it is incredibly detailed as an assembly and a lot of fun to build up. With the final part now going on, I hope you can see what I mean when I did say it is a really cool looking assembly. Now, moving on to doing the rotor blades themselves. I wanted to try something which I did a few months ago in this ink patina effect on the rotor blades. So they were initially primed in Mr. Surfacer 1500 black, and then I gave it a nice wet coat of X20A, and then the ink could go on. After leaving the ink for a minute just for it to settle, I can use these really stiff-headed brush and start to stipple the ink into this paint. It takes a lot of work and you almost have to constantly be moving and working with it, but if you stick with it and use a little bit of heat to evaporate off any of the X20A, you're left with this really convincing marble effect, as you'll see in a moment. And there you go, isn't that a brilliant base to then paint over to give a sun-bleached looking rotor blade? I was really happy with how it came out. So I can now just use Mr. Colour's black to very gently blend it in and hopefully not lose this effect too much. After I'd let the paint to dry, I could mask off any of the metallic aspects of the blades, get them sprayed and painted, and put to one side for now. It was now time to move on to doing some weathering on the main aircraft. Initially, everything received a black light panel line wash to really make all those rivets and details pop. After it had dried, any excess was wiped off using a paper towel. The panel line wash itself did a great job of giving the Huey a slightly more grimy tinted effect. However, for some more localized and focused grime, I'm going to be using Amomig's oil brusher, specifically the black one. Small amounts are deposited along panel lines or rivet lines or access hatches and are very gently blended into the surroundings. I wanted to blend it in quite a lot as I didn't want it to be too stark on the overall model. After leaving it overnight to dry, the next morning I gave it a coating of VMS's matte varnish. This was a mistake. This was far too matte for my liking, and I wish I would have used satin instead to give a little bit more of a shine, as from references that is how they were. But anyway, we roll with the punches. Another thing which broke my heart was when I was taking off the masking tape, I heard an almighty crack and seemingly I'd reopened a seam on the nose. That part of the nose was very thin, so I wasn't surprised that the plastic had unfortunately cracked. It was at a stage where I personally could not be bothered to go back and resand everything, so I hope you can forgive me on that one. Now, the final stage of weathering was going to be using Amomig's lock and load pen and just doing a little bit of chipping along a few of the high access areas like the access panels, the doors, any handles, etc, etc. I was really on the home straight now, only a few sub-assemblies to go until this one was all finished. They all slot into position, thankfully, rather well. A few of them have a very tight fit though, including these two stabilisers which go on the spine or kind of tail section of the helicopter. I was pushing so hard to try and get these into position. So then, with the rotor blades into position and a quick dusting off, that sums up this build. So thank you very much for watching this video. I really do hope that you've enjoyed it. If you have, please consider a like and subscribe. But anyway, without any further ado, enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time, guys. Bye bye.
We've got negative rockets either. Get Stogie over here.
Grounding on the right side. Pressure.
Roger, so that's all hill.
Got AKs down there.
Okay, roger that. I'll be answering no one.
We're low this time, Dalton.
Okay, it's Stogie working over. There he goes.
DC, return to the KC for another lift. The next LZ will be just about hammer plate far closer to minimum.
Roger. We've got negative rockets either. Get Stogie over here.
Grounding on the right side. Pressure.
Roger, so that's all hill.
Got AKs down there.
Okay, roger that. I'll be answering no one.
We're low this time, Dalton.
Okay, it's Stogie working over. There he goes.